Welcome to another weekend episode of Software Engineering Daily, where we deviate from the traditional topics of interviews with highly technical experts. Of course, this will also be an interview with a highly technical expert, but today's topic is Internet.org. I conducted the recorded interview that will air shortly several months ago when I was working on a different podcast called The Wooden Computer, which was a podcast about art and computation and culture. And this interview was with the EFF's Jeremy Malcolm. The EFF is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They fight for legal rights on the internet, just in electronic stuff in general. You can check them out at EFF.org. But this episode was inspired originally by this article called Internet.org, Not Secure, Not Neutral, and Not the Internet. And I originally emailed him because I felt that after reading the article, it was somewhat of a loaded, kind of link-baity title. I felt it wasn't giving adequate credibility to Internet.org. And I feel like the vast majority of my listeners will probably think that Internet.org is this anti-net neutrality, terrible thing. If you don't know about Internet.org, it's this initiative by Facebook to bring free internet access, but at a limited bandwidth quality to people in developing countries such as India. Anyway, we'll get into that in that episode. But I just wanted to record this preamble to say that this was an episode I recorded in the past. That's why the sound quality is slightly lower. It was recorded for a different podcast more than a year ago. And with that, I guess I just want to mention that I'm so overjoyed to be doing Software Engineering Daily because it's a podcast that people are actually listening to, and I've been doing podcasting for a while, and it's really nice to have a listener base and a group of people who I can get feedback from. So with that in mind, please give me feedback. Let me know if you like this topic. It's not closely related to software engineering, but it's closely related to the developments of the internet, and it will give you some insights into what's going on with Internet.org and India, and obviously my personal editorial opinion on these developments. I hope you enjoy it. This is Wooden Computer, a show about technology, creativity, and humanity. Today's show is about Internet.org. Internet.org is a partnership between Facebook and 6 mobile phone companies that plans to bring affordable access to selected internet services to less developed countries by increasing efficiency and facilitating the development of new business models around the provision of internet access. My guest Jeremy Malcolm is a member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He wrote a piece called Internet.org is Not Secure, Not Neutral, and Not the Internet, which was published on the EFF's website.
Thanks very much for having me, Jeff.
What is Internet.org?
Well, when it first launched, it was kind of ambiguous as to what it would actually be. It just said that it wanted to bring the internet to the rest of the 2/3 of the world that don't already have it, which sounded great, but there were some impressive partners listed along with Facebook, but exactly how they were going to accomplish it took some time to come together. So that's why it's been only recently that it started attracting attention when we realized what the methods were. And although there may be other methods, the one that's causing controversy is the presentation of selected internet sites, including Facebook, for free over mobile phone connections, which excludes the rest of the internet, which is not available for free.
And so you wrote a piece called Internet.org is Not Secure, Not Neutral, and Not the Internet. So let's break down those concerns separately. What are the concerns that you have that resulted in that sort of title?
Okay, well, the not the internet is really just what I've already said, because it is certain selected websites. Initially, Facebook had a bundle of sites that they chose, which would vary from country to country, and they were a reasonable cross section of for-profit and not-for-profit sites, including Wikipedia. Of course, we're great friends with Wikipedia. They do an awesome service, but we don't think that they should be singled out by a central authority such as Facebook and its partners to the exclusion of other equally good free resources. And in fact, maybe one of the things that makes the internet great is not that it has a few single great resources, but rather that it's got thousands and thousands of little tiny, web pages here and there on very specific topics, and losing that for the sake of a few major properties such as Facebook and Wikipedia, that is not the internet. That's not what the internet is about. The internet is about something that we can all participate in creating. We can all put up our own content. We can navigate for hours and hours and find sites that we never knew about before, and that was not possible with Internet.org, particularly in its original incarnation where it was a bundle of just a handful of sites. Since then, Facebook have revised the service so that it can include an arbitrary number of sites, but they still have to go through a vetting process. And that leads us to the other criticism in my post. Well, I should say it's a post that I co-wrote with another Jeremy from EFF, and that is that it's not secure. The reason why it's not secure is because Facebook had to disable HTTPS websites from being accessed through the service unless you use an Android app with the Internet.org application on the phone. So the reason why they had to do that is interesting. It's not because they want to snoop on your connection per se, but they disable the secured HTTPS connections because there's no other way that the phone carriers that they work with can work out whether the content ought to be free or not. For example, there may be a web domain like bbc.co.uk where some of the content is free and some of it is not. For example, videos are not free over the Internet.org service. Those are excluded. And if a connection is encrypted, there's no way for the phone company that's providing the carriage of the Internet.org service to differentiate between the free stuff and the not free stuff. And another problem that Facebook found was that they wanted to show an interstitial message when you're leaving the Internet.org free service and going to a paid service to warn you about that so that you wouldn't accidentally be incurring charges without realizing it. And there was no way for them to do that with the HTTPS encrypted websites enabled. So these are the technical reasons why they have disabled HTTPS over Internet.org. But the practical outcome of that is the problem that it leaves people open to being snooped on, to have identity theft, to have all of the other problems that come along with insecure internet connections, particularly worrying in countries where there are repressive governments that may be looking for activists and whistleblowers to prosecute. So that's why it's not secure. And not neutral simply means that zero rating can be a form of discrimination between some websites and other websites on the basis of their content, and that is a net neutrality violation. Now, there's a debate, an ongoing debate, I think, as to whether all forms of zero rating are a violation of net neutrality, or whether in some cases it can be justified. In the United States, as you may know, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, recently set out its rules for managing net neutrality, and zero rating was not an absolute prohibition there. They left it to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But in this instance, I think it's fairly clear.
Could you define zero rating?
Well, zero rating is where either you pay for the data that you download, and certain sites are exempted from that and given to you for free, or maybe you have a data cap, which allows you to download, say, a gigabyte of data on a mobile connection, and once you reach that cap, then it's either throttled or else you pay for the excess usage. And again, zero-rated sites are exempted from that. So you can download as much as you want from the zero-rated sites, but once you start to go to another website that's not within the zero rating, then you either incur charges or it comes off that limited download cap that you have. And this is pretty common on mobile phone accounts in many countries, and in some countries also on fixed line accounts. It's not so popular in the US for that to be the case. It's not so common, I should say, but in other countries it is. Like even if you have a DSL connection at home, it may come with a download cap, which may be relatively limited, like a few gigabytes. And if you go above that, then the speed of the connection may be throttled or you may be charged extra. So that's what zero rating is. And the problem that it's perceived to have is that it really disincentivizes you to explore that wider internet. You're more inclined to just stay within Facebook because Facebook is free, and the rest of the web will just remain a mystery to you because it's outside of what your provider has decided to give you for free.
So let's talk a bit about the security, and then we'll come back to the neutrality aspect. So a key criticism that you make is what you said before, the lack of support for HTTPS. And so without HTTPS, a user is more exposed to a government that's trying to engage in surveillance. That's pretty much the most important component of HTTPS, at least in the scope of your argument. But the thing is, as we've seen with the US and with China, governments that want to listen in on what people are saying can do so whether or not users have HTTPS. And especially if it's a naive user, maybe giving them HTTPS and telling them that their communications are secure, couldn't that be more dangerous than just giving them an insecure connection and acknowledging that their communication channel is not safe?
Well, we haven't quite given up on HTTPS. We still think that it can be effective. It's possible to circumvent it in various ways, but often those depend on security flaws in the implementation. Or
man-in-the-middle attacks.
Yeah, exactly. So the logjam vulnerability was in the news, has been in the news recently. That relies on a less secure form of HTTPS, which you can fix. You can fix by upgrading the server certificate that's presented to the user when they access the website, and the problem goes away. So we think that, according to Edward Snowden even, strong crypto still does work, and HTTPS encryption does pose a barrier, at least to those who want to surveil. It's not absolute. You can have a bug on your computer, placed on your computer, which can just record your keystrokes secretively, and you have no way of knowing that that's happening, and that can happen regardless of the HTTPS. It can take screenshots of your screen and send them surreptitiously. So these things do happen, and if you have someone who really wants to surveil you, they will do that. So you're right to say that it's not a 100% guarantee of security, but it does make things a lot harder. We're not just thinking about governments, we're also thinking about cyber criminals, people who may want to steal your data for financial gain. There are even spammers and so on. So there's a range of reasons why we want security. But protecting, if you're Edward Snowden, this is not going to help you. But if you're an ordinary citizen, it is a layer of protection that we recommend.
Okay, so I guess let's talk about the approval process. So the biggest issue, as I understand, the biggest issue that you have with Internet.org is the approval process that sites have to go through to be part of Internet.org's free service. give a definition of net neutrality and explain why Internet.org scares net neutrality activists.
Well, the definition that we and a number of other groups around the world have settled on, which is just an abbreviated definition, it's not absolutely watertight, but we say that net neutrality requires that the internet be maintained as an open platform on which network providers treat all content, applications, and services equally without discrimination. So the reason why I say that's not an absolute definition is that there may be some edge cases where reasonable forms of discrimination are allowed for things like network management. But the basic idea is all content, applications, and services are treated equally. And so Internet.org does not treat all content equally. It treats the content that has been approved by the Internet.org partners as a higher priority than the rest of the internet. The criteria that they have, admittedly, are not really based on the type of content. So, and we applaud that. Like, we're glad that they're not saying, okay, sexual content is disallowed, political content is disallowed. They're not saying that. They're saying we're not going to allow things that we feel the mobile providers won't be able to support for free on their networks. And that includes large images, it includes videos, and it also includes things that the handset won't be able to process, such as JavaScript, such as embedded fonts, and Java applets, and Flash. So all of these are technical requirements that are imposed, but they still. We think that mobile technology is advancing very fast, and we don't believe that putting these requirements in place now is the answer. Maybe in a few years' time, we will see a greater penetration of 3G and 4G networks around the world. We will see more affordable smartphones, $25, $40 smartphones being available in developing countries, and these phones will have the ability to access videos and VoIP and large images. And so putting these restrictions in place is really a short-term measure that we feel is short-sighted. We would much rather, if Facebook and its partners were going to put in a limited service, then it should be limited only by the speed or by the amount of data that can be accessed for free, rather than by the type of content that's embedded in a website.
But to me, it seems like that's having a rate limited experience with the internet is just as much of a lesser experience than having the scope of your site, of your websites that you can visit, reduced. I mean, one way or another, if your internet experience is lessened relative to, the unlimited, westernized, open internet with lots of images and JavaScript and so on, one way or another, it's not the same as the wholly rich, westernized internet. So, it's essentially at this point there's no way to have your cake and eat it too. I don't really understand why. It seems like a value judgment to me to say that the rate capped experience is qualitatively better than the uncapped experience where you can enjoy it all day, but maybe it's just a text version of a walled garden internet.
Yeah, well, I understand that argument, and the net neutrality activists were criticized by Facebook, well, I guess indirectly criticized, by implying that no internet is good enough unless it's the full internet experience. And I think that criticism has some validity. We don't think we do agree that some internet is better than no internet, but it's a question of what you define as the internet. And the internet has never been a filtered service like this. It's never been a curated, moderated service like this. That's been one of the critical differentiators between the internet and something like the old AOL service, where there's a curator or a moderator there who gets to choose what you see. That's never been what the internet is about, and we think that is a qualitative difference between a rate-limited service that's just slow and a service like Internet.org that's moderated in this way. The other thing is we can't expect. There've always been tiers of service. There's always been price points where you can get a fast connection or a slow connection. That's not going to change, and we can't expect a philanthropic or semi-philanthropic endeavor like this to give free high-speed internet to everyone. It's simply not possible. So being realistic, we have to concede that some kind of downgrading of commercial services is necessary. Also, I think that the partners in Internet.org want to provide a pathway for people to upgrade to a full-speed connection. And although they have commercial motives in doing that, it's difficult to argue with. You know, the internet is provided commercially. We want to have non-commercial options for those who have no other way of accessing the internet. And Internet.org is not the only one of those options. Also, you have access through public libraries and through other forms of public internet access like cyber cafes. So, the combination of those should be available to those on low incomes or who have no other way of accessing the internet, but it doesn't need to be the full high-speed experience that is available commercially, because that would be expecting too much.
I want to dissect your criticism of Internet.org as, quote, not the internet. So I agree that Internet.org is not the same as the open, westernized experience that we get to enjoy, because on Internet.org, users can only visit sites that have gone through the whitelisting approval process. But this is similar to, you can draw similarities of this experience to the experience of users in places like China or Russia, where the internet is blocked in certain points because it could be politically volatile. And then in India, there's censorship around pornographic material. There's censorship in various places. But in each of these cases, we wouldn't go as far as to say that what China has is not the internet. And we wouldn't say that India doesn't have the real internet because it's not the internet, if it doesn't have all the pornography of Western internet. So why do you say definitively that Internet.org is, quote, not the internet? Because this seems like a pretty scathing criticism.
Well, we do criticize. I think the Chinese internet has been criticized as not the internet. I'm trying to put my finger on exactly where that has come up. I know there are some commentators who say what the Chinese people access is not actually the internet. But in terms of nomenclature, I don't think it really matters. We oppose censorship and filtering. That's what it boils down to. And whether the point where you draw the line between a certain amount of censorship and filtering that makes something just a filtered internet, and then when you go beyond that point, it's not the internet. I don't think that's really important. There is a line there somewhere. I think probably Internet.org is on the wrong side of that line, because you're really going to be looking at 90% of websites realistically that can't be accessed. So when you reach that 90% point, certainly at that point, it's no longer the internet. Whether the cutoff line is 50%, 20%, 10%, who knows? But certainly by the time you get to what Facebook.org is, it's an opt-in process for websites to be available on Internet.org. You have to go through and submit your site for approval. What is the likelihood that more than 10% of websites will do that? I think it's very low. It's erecting a barrier that most of the millions of websites that are available on the net simply won't bother to clear. So at that point, what you're left with is not the internet. But your point is still valid, that we are critical of all sorts of filtering, and the Russian internet, the Chinese internet, the Turkish internet. These are also in need of advocacy to remove these barriers to content, and we do take that battle on as well as our advocacy against the Internetorg service.
But do they really need that much advocacy? Because so you say that Internet.org, quote, Internet.org would be much easier to censor than a true global internet, and as we've seen, people in China and Russia and India, they have enough money to afford regular internet in many cases, but they still get a censored experience in many cases, and they get and you can get if you use Internet.org, you also get a censored experience. But we're seeing in these places that censorship doesn't actually matter that much, because in practice, the internet's just simply too big for the government or anyone else to really effectively censor. As long as if you could spend all your day on the internet, and even if it's a text-only experience, the content is too dynamic to regulate. There's too much material, and even if you just spent, I imagine, even if I spent all my time on Facebook, I would have such a more expansive view of the world than if I was, for example, had an unlimited westernized view into the internet in 1995. And if you look at the youth in these places, if you see how they interact online and offline, they mostly tend to think that their government's totally absurd and totally embarrassing for any of these censorship tactics. So the censorship clearly isn't working. You don't have these fascist youth that are falling in line with everything that their government is saying, and they're within their censored scope of the internet. So what I'm saying is, I don't disagree that this approval process opens up the possibility for censorship, and actually, the approval process is inherently censorious. But your characterization of Internet.org is that this approval process is so toxic that users will have their experience reduced to something that is not the internet, and not the internet. That's the only thing I can think of that's really close to being that bad is like North Korean internet, which is just really they narrow it down so much that it really does fall in line with their fascist intranet sort of world. But you seem to be saying that the only thing that truly qualifies as the internet is this platform where any site whatsoever can be accessed. And if I can't access the deep web, through just my Comcast connection in the United States, am I being deprived of the true internet?
Well, again, I don't want to dwell too much on the definitional side of it. It's more important to break it down and say, what are we opposed to? So there are two things that we're opposed to. We're opposed to regular style of internet censorship, which takes particular content offline. That's one thing. But the other thing that differentiates Internet.org from that is not only the scope of sites that are excluded, but also the fact that there is a central gatekeeper, which is Facebook and its partners in Internet.org, where all of the requests have to go through. And that is something that even in countries that do have censorship of particular websites, they don't necessarily have a central, certainly not a private sector central actor who controls where the information passes. They may have a few backbone links into the country, which are also points of control, but most likely they don't have a single one like what Facebook and Internet.org are. So that's a super added risk in addition to the problems of censorship. The fact that Facebook can then be targeted very easily, not only by governments but also by content owners, by political figures, by people of influence, by other companies, and induced to shape the service in a particular way, to exclude certain services, to include certain services. I mean, we can very clearly imagine, Sony Corporation, not to mention names, might say, hey, we want you to block all of these sites that are competing with us, and we want you to highlight our service on Internet.org. So I'm not saying that Facebook would capitulate to that sort of pressure, but they might. The pressure is there, and it's just another choke point that powerful governments and corporations can use to try and shape and mold the internet experience of these users.
So, but Facebook has been dealing with governments and special interest groups for years. So have there been a pattern of cases where Facebook has shown a willingness to censor on behalf of governments or corporations or special interest groups?
Yes, there have been cases, and some of those are also highlighted on EFF's website. If you do a search for Facebook there, you will find cases where it's bowed down to requests from authorities that we didn't think were valid. We don't single out Facebook in that request. Sometimes Twitter does the same thing. Sometimes Google does the same thing. That's inevitable to some extent, because a company that comes under orders from a government may have little choice but to comply, especially where the company has employees on the ground in that country or has assets in that country, because the government can simply arrest those employees or seize the company's property if they don't comply. So we don't necessarily blame internet companies for sometimes capitulating to that sort of pressure, because they may have little choice. But what they can do is avoid placing themselves in the position where they can be forced to comply. And they can do that by not setting up company offices in repressive countries, for one thing. They can also do it by not putting themselves in a gatekeeper position, as Internet.org does put Facebook. So if you don't want to be forced to censor, don't place yourself in a position where you're vulnerable to being forced to do so.
But isn't the alternative of if Facebook doesn't take on this gatekeeper role, which they may see as more just an opportunistic, nobody else is doing this, why isn't anybody doing this sort of role, isn't the alternative effectively that there is censorship in the sense that these people just automatically will get deprived of internet? I mean, they're not, it seems like the user activity shows that these people would not use an alternative service. Like maybe if Facebook offered an alternative service, like some super low rate capped service, maybe these people would opt in. But the user behavior seems to indicate that many of the people they don't even know that there's an internet out there, or they don't even really understand what the internet is. And really, the only way to incentivize them to use the internet is to give them a completely free option.
Yeah, well, we have found that in countries where there is a convenient sort of package available through a mobile phone service that includes maybe just Facebook or Twitter or some of the other major services, including chat services like WhatsApp, those will be the ones that people use, and they won't realize that there is a larger internet. They don't understand the difference between Facebook and the internet. There was a survey of users in Indonesia, for example, recently, and a lot more people said that they used Facebook than the people who said they used the internet, because they didn't realize that Facebook is simply a part of the internet. So that is what will happen, and that is happening now in these countries. I used to live in Malaysia for about 6 years, and the mobile providers there did offer competing packages of free zero-rated services. So some of them might have Facebook, Twitter, others might have WhatsApp, or there are equivalents of WhatsApp in Southeast Asia that are very popular. There's one called Line. There's one called Kakao Talk. So one provider might offer Line, another one might offer Kakao Talk. So there was some competition between the providers to that degree. So it wasn't the worst case of zero rating where you're forced to only use WhatsApp. You do at least have a choice between WhatsApp, Line, and KakaoTalk, but you may have to use 3 different providers to get that choice. So it's still anti-competitive, but there's a degree of competition between mobile providers at least. So I did find in Malaysia that people would use those services on their mobile phones, but they wouldn't use anything else. But then something kind of remarkable happened in Malaysia, and that was that the mobile provider that I used started to offer free access to any internet service on your mobile with no discrimination, but subject to a rate limiting a rate limit. And that was sort of a game changer. From that point, people would start to use their phones for more than just Facebook and Twitter. Admittedly, Facebook and Twitter, because they're such huge services, that's what mostly people are using it for anyway. But people would start to go to the Transit Authority's website to find out when the next bus is coming. They would go to the Weather Bureau of Meteorology to find out what tomorrow's weather was going to be. They would start to use Skype over their mobile phone connection if they could at that sort of low band rate. And that is the kind of thing that we think we would like to see a lot more of. There are local message boards that are immensely popular. There's one in Malaysia called, it's gone out of my head. Lao, I can't quite remember, but it's very popular. So it's the equivalent of Craigslist or something here, but more so. And that was something that was never zero rated. You would never get free access to that. But when you have a rate-limited service, that becomes something that a lot more people will use. So I think that's a much better model, and it is not outside of the scope of Internet.org to do something like that. I think the original messaging of Facebook about Internet.org was just, we want to bring the Internet to the other 2/3 of the world. Well, that's a better way of doing it. Up until now, Facebook hasn't been paying money to the mobile operators, hasn't been subsidizing them. So maybe that's why they haven't done something like this, because the mobile operators would maybe seek some sort of subsidy to offer that service. But I think it's still worth exploring. I mean, because the mobile operator in Malaysia that I mentioned was not receiving any subsidy to offer that service. It was simply offering it as an entry level that people could upgrade to a faster connection if they outgrew it. So I think that is the kind of Internet.org that we would like to see.
The Wooden Computer podcast is sponsored by Hired.com. Hired.com is the marketplace for recruiting startup and tech talent. So let me ask you a broader question about why you felt motivated to write this piece and kind of from a critical point of view. So the way that when I look at Internet.org, it definitely seems like, they have this overarching view of they want to get the other 2/3 of the internet, the other 2/3 of the world onto the internet, and it strikes me that they are going to err on the side of practicality above all, and whether that practicality ends up undermining some, the globally defined sense of neutrality, or if that practicality sometimes undermines Facebook's, immediate business opportunities. Like, I think they're always just gonna err on the side of really just trying to get these people connected in any sort of manner that they can, and basically because, like, in terms of like long-term value, there's simply so much unbridled amount of value that Facebook can get if it simply gets these people online as quickly as possible in whatever context. And I think it's kind of damaging when Facebook gets painted as having these well thought out malicious long-term plans, maybe to snoop on the users or
Yeah.
because like it doesn't even make sense from a business point of view for Facebook to do that. Like
No.
it makes the most sense for Facebook to just be like, oh my God, we got to get all these people connected as quickly as possible before the internet is like not even a technology that gets used anymore, because who knows what's going to happen in 10 years, right? It just needs to get people connected to the internet and get them, just using the internet like normal people do. So that's why I'm kind of surprised when I read that the piece. I was like, why do you need to attack Facebook? Facebook's interests are almost completely aligned with the interests of just wanting to get these people having access to free information.
Well, I think you've hit on a point that struck us also. We were worried that Facebook was being demonized too much over this. So it may not seem to you that way, but our post was meant to be a kind of a middle ground here. We had a lot of people saying Facebook is just doing this to collect your data so they can advertise to you, and this is just a malicious thing. And we've even had people talking about zero rating lately in terms that are way beyond what's acceptable. They're talking about slavery and the Holocaust and stuff like that, and you're like, whoa, stop. Zero rating is not that, and what Facebook is doing is not that bad in the scheme of things. They're trying to do the right thing here. We just think they're doing it in the wrong way. So from our perspective, we actually wanted to push back against that. There was also a letter that went out to Facebook that we didn't sign. We don't want to disassociate ourselves too strongly with that letter, but there was an open letter that other groups did sign on to. We were considering signing it, and in the end, we thought it was just a bit too strong. So we didn't sign on to that. So we are actually trying to strike a middle ground here. We're saying, good on you, Facebook. We agree with what you're doing. We agree with what you're trying to do. We disagree with the way that you're doing it. And we do want to see Internet.org evolve into something better, whereas other people are just saying, no, just scrap the whole thing. We would rather see Internet.org become something like what I described, where there's an entry level of service to mobile internet that's available for free, but it doesn't require sites to be vetted by Facebook and approved onto this whitelist.
I mean, it's good to hear that you are on that more tempered side of things, but I still am surprised by the titling and the messaging of the article, because, like it or not, there are going to be a lot of people that read the title, they don't read between the lines, and EFF is a trusted source, and the messaging can be confusing, and it can be harmful, and can undermine the potential for Internet.org, I think. So that, like, and I get that in, as you've outlined, the title of the article, Internet.org is not neutral, not secure, and not the internet. As you've broken down the components of the title, you do have well-reasoned arguments for each of those pieces of the title. But I still think that overall it comes off as, and I don't mean to to drill too much into the title and the messaging and the marketing or whatever else, but the reality is that a lot of people are just going to read that and maybe skim the article a little bit, and all they're really going to take away from the messaging is like, holy crap, the EFF thinks that Internet.org is a conspiracy, and like that sucks, I think.
Well, that's not our intention. I think you can't, in this age of 140 character messaging, you are always going to have that. I think whether it's an issue like this, or whether it's Gamergate or whatever, people are going to just take an extreme view of your messaging away, and that's unfortunate. I don't think there's much we can do about that. If people don't read the whole article, that's kind of down to them. But this isn't an issue this isn't our last word on the issue. We've posted a couple of times about this topic, and we'll continue to do so. I think there is room to discuss, for example, where zero rating might be acceptable. Are there some edge cases where zero-rated services actually are beneficial and they're not going to destroy competition. That's something that we've actually thought hard about. We had a meeting with Wikipedia to try and figure out if there was some way that we could support their zero-rated service, which is Wikipedia Zero. We decided that we couldn't because it really does still have that same core problem of cutting people off from the rest of the internet.
That's interesting. I don't know anything about Wikipedia Zero. Could you explain more about that?
Yeah, well, Wikipedia Zero was a similar concept to Facebook's Internetorg, where Wikipedia did a deal with mobile providers in certain countries to allow access to Wikipedia for free. Now, this is a slightly different kettle of fish than Internet.org for a number of reasons. One, the conditions on which they did this deal were fully transparent. There was no money changing hands. There was no advertising on the site. It was not co-branded with the mobile provider or with anyone else. So that was, we were happy about that. We were still unable to clear that hurdle, though, of the fact that people would access Wikipedia and then nothing else, and they would think this is the internet. So there are other ways of getting access to knowledge out there. We would love to partner with Wikipedia on some of those. Other examples are they used to distribute DVDs of Wikipedia content and making Wikipedia available in other ways, like through public internet access services like libraries and so on, we think is a great idea. But cutting the rest of the internet off and having this little silo, which is just Wikipedia, that was a similar problem to Internet.org for us, and we weren't able to support that, which was kind of a bitter-sweet decision that we had to come to because we really love Wikipedia so much that it was a shame we couldn't support their concept. But we think there may be some scope for zero-rated services that are permissible in really narrow cases because they don't harm competition, they don't cut people off from the rest of the internet, and we haven't yet fully fleshed those out. There's sort of an oblique reference to those in the post that we're talking about today, where we mention where is it? Let me just, I've got the post up on the screen now. I can't find it, but there's the case where content is peered at an internet exchange point, and in some countries, local content that's peered at such an internet exchange point is made available for free to content of those ISPs. So there may, for example, be a local university that has archives that are available to people in that area. There may be mirrors of downloadable files and local television stations that stream their services. So because those are local, there may be some justification, particularly in countries where there's not such a strong body of local language content. There may be some argument in making that available for free to users in the local area. So that's the kind of thing that we're willing to explore. But something that is elevating one website above others globally, that's where we have problems, whether it's Wikipedia, whether it's Facebook, or whatever it is.
I still don't understand the rigidity of that position because you mentioned AOL before, and I think the AOL analogy is good. So, many of the people whom Internet.org wants to bring online have never used the internet before. They don't understand it, and it's an uphill battle to just convince them that the internet could be useful in their lives. So for a brand new internet user, having an internet whitelist, this approval list of just sites that are reachable by zero rate is fantastic. I mean, we saw this with AOL. It wasn't a zero rate with AOL, but it was it was a walled garden in any sense. And people actually loved the walled garden experience of AOL. And over time, as they explored AOL, people understood that there was a lot more beyond that walled garden. And in most cases, they eventually got a web browser and pursued beyond AOL's content because, I mean, eventually, like, Facebook is going to feel like using Microsoft Windows. It's going to feel outdated. It's going to feel like a weird constricted version of what computer usage should be. And so I don't. It seems like the stance against Internet.org and the same stance against Wikipedia Zero, that it gives people maybe this false perception that Wikipedia is the entire internet, or Facebook is the entire internet, or Internet.org is the entire internet. I think it kind of it smacks of this, like, maybe this belief that the people that are using these services are so naive that they're going to be unable to understand that there is a world beyond the applications that they're using, which is just that's not realistic. I mean, they're gonna figure it out. They're gonna say eventually, like, oh my god, I'm just using this encyclopedia for all of my internet usage. Why am I not going out and using these other applications?
Well, it's an optimistic view that you're taking there. We have the most powerful internet companies in the world. Facebook is one of the most powerful internet companies in the world. To think that they won't turn into a monopoly with control over the way people use the internet in developing countries is an optimistic position.
No, it's the same. It's just. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's just the same. It's patterned off of what happened with America. I mean, AOL didn't become a monopoly. Microsoft's monopoly like crumbled as quickly as it was developed.
So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that is the best case scenario. The best case scenario is that people will, as you describe, they will grow up using Facebook and these other websites, but they will move on. So that's the best case scenario. That's what we can hope for. But there's a risk there that the opposite will happen, and that you will have media monopolies, internet monopolies developing in the same way that we have had media monopolies developing in the broadcast space and in like cable TV and even in broadcast and print media. So it's a decision that we have to take. Do we want to go down that path? Do we want to risk that developing? Or do we want to put a stop to it now so that we don't have to later go down the track of antitrust action and then trying to open the internet back up ex post facto? We would favour addressing the problem now and stopping that sort of monopoly from developing in the first place.
But don't you think that there is a really significant downside risk of the status quo continuing for really like any measurable period of time? I mean, internet usage, the growth of new internet users has slowed. We really need to get the rest of the world online, like one way or another. It seems like we should just be encouraging almost relentlessly, like just cheering on these sorts of endeavors, whether there is some potential for a monopoly that would be temporary. Even if the monopoly did develop, it would almost certainly be temporary, because that's how the story has played out with these internet monopolies. I mean, I don't really think it's an optimistic approach. I think it's a pretty realistic approach. It's just based on how things have gone in the past. I guess to start to close off, like, why is there this sort of cynical perception that there really is a big risk of this monopolistic overtaking of internet services? I mean, hasn't the past like 10 or 15 years or 20 years just shown that over time the internet becomes decreasingly monopolized, decreasingly regulated? No matter what anybody does, it seems like it becomes increasingly fragmented over time and increasingly impossible to regulate. I
don't think that's what we have seen over the long term. We've seen a increasing centralization of the internet, where there are far fewer services that most people use. The majority of people are all using Gmail for their email. The majority are using Facebook for their social network, and Twitter for their for microblogging. Whereas 15 years ago, there was a very different picture where there were far fewer dominant players. And we've seen a lot of consolidation. We've seen a lot of reduction in the number of competing apps and services, and that's what we see continuing, and that's the problem that we identify with Internet.org, that it reduces the diversity of the internet to these major properties, I guess. And so I kind of disagree with you there that the internet is still flourishing and diverse. I think it's increasingly less diverse.
Interesting. Okay, well, just one last question. I guess that's I want to try to just ask a sort of offbeat type of question, but do you think that reading book? I feel like the current generation of influential, a lot of influential voices in the internet world seem very influenced by reading books like 1984 and maybe Brave New World. And do you think that maybe these books, this type of literature has played an outsized role in shaping how we view the potential for our future to develop, maybe to a degree that is disproportionate with the chances of the things in those books actually playing out into reality?
Well, I think you've also got a more rosy view of the internet than I have there as well. I mean, in the post-Snowden era, we've seen 1984 playing out in absolute clockwork fashion. There's a huge battle for the freedom of internet users that is just mounting all the time. EFF is growing. We've got more than 60 staff on board now, but we're still overwhelmed with what we have to deal with. I'm part of the international team at EFF. We're like 6 people, and we have to confront problems in 196 countries, whereas we have the colleagues. The majority of our colleagues are just focused on the United States, which itself is always more than enough, providing more than enough work for them. So there are a lot of these predictions in 1984 and Brave New World have already come true. Surveillance, invasion of privacy, not only from governments but also from corporations, which are tracking us across the web, which are putting our information in databases without our consent, which are marketing to us in new ways, and compromising the security of our personal computing. This is the stuff of science fiction, yes, but it's actually coming true. It's actually happening. So we don't like to be on the negative. There are some positive things too. We are always in awe of how much innovation the internet has spurred, and the services that are sprouting up all the time are still a magnificent achievement for humanity, and the internet has been absolutely essential to that. But there are threats from all sides. There are threats from government surveillance. There are threats from intellectual property enforcement. There are threats from private companies. So it's achieving a balance where the most personal freedom is possible, where freedom of expression and privacy are upheld, where innovation is possible, and where the legitimate democratic laws are also able to coexist with the internet. That's what we want to achieve. We are against undemocratic processes for controlling the internet, but we have no problem with the rule of law. I mean, the rule of law is something that we uphold. A lot of the work that we do is through the legal system. So we think it is possible to achieve a balance where civil liberties are upheld and where the internet can remain as a free and human rights compliant medium. So we have a long battle. It's never done, but that's what we're aiming for. And we think that if the future holds, if the two-thirds of the internet who don't, two-thirds of the world who don't currently have access to the internet can join us in a really free and vibrant and innovative internet, then that would be what we want to see.